A woman loses the love of her life, only to discover the life he left behind is built on lies and crushing debt. But what her in-laws do next will leave you stunned. This isn't just a story about grief, it's about betrayal, impossible choices, and a future no one saw coming. Thank you so much for watching and for all your comments. Let me know at the end if you liked the story and where you're watching from. Sarah Miller had always believed in fairy tales. As the only daughter of a modest family in rural Michigan, she'd grown up dreaming of a life filled with love and security. At 23, she thought she'd found her happily ever after when she met Robert Thompson, the handsome son of a wealthy cattle rancher from Montana. Their courtship was brief but passionate. Robert swept her off her feet with promises of a beautiful life together on his family's sprawling ranch. Sarah's parents had their reservations about the rushed marriage, but seeing their daughter so happy, they gave their blessing. The wedding was small but elegant, held in the Thompson family's private chapel. Sarah couldn't help but notice the cold stares from Robert's parents, Elizabeth and William Thompson, but she dismissed them as wedding day jitters. She was determined to win them over with time. "You look beautiful," Robert whispered as they shared their first dance as husband and wife. "I promise to give you everything you've ever wanted." Sarah believed him. How could she not? His eyes held such sincerity, such devotion. She had no reason to doubt his words or his love. The newlyweds moved into a small cottage on the edge of the Thompson Ranch. It wasn't the grand house Sarah had imagined, but Robert assured her it was temporary until they saved enough to build their dream home. "My parents are traditional," Robert explained one evening as they sat on their porch, watching the sunset. "They believe a man should earn his place, even if he's their son. We'll have to work hard, but it'll be worth it." Sarah nodded, admiring his determination. "I don't mind hard work, Robert, as long as we're together." The first few months of marriage were blissful. Sarah learned to cook Robert's favorite meals, tended to their small garden, and even helped with some of the ranch work. She tried repeatedly to bond with her in-laws, bringing them freshly baked goods and offering to help Elizabeth with household chores. But her efforts were met with polite indifference. "Give them time," Robert would say whenever Sarah expressed her concerns. "They're just set in their ways." 6 months into their marriage, Sarah discovered she was pregnant. The news filled her with immeasurable joy. That evening, she prepared a special dinner to surprise Robert. "I have something to tell you," she said, her eyes shining with excitement as they sat down to eat. Robert looked up from his plate, a tired smile on his face. "What is it, sweetheart?" "We're going to have a baby," Sarah announced, her hand instinctively moving to her still flat stomach. "You're going to be a father." For a moment, Robert sat frozen, his fork suspended mid-air. Then, to Sarah's relief, his face broke into a wide grin. He rose from his chair, circled the table, and pulled her into a tight embrace. "A baby," he whispered against her hair. "Our baby. This is wonderful news, Sarah. I love you so much." That night, as they lay in bed, Robert placed his hand on Sarah's stomach and spoke softly about all the things he would teach their child: riding horses, fishing in the creek, watching the stars on clear Montana nights. Sarah fell asleep, with a smile on her face, her heart full of hope for their future. The next morning, Robert left before dawn for a cattle drive that would keep him away for 3 days. Sarah spent those days daydreaming about their growing family, making lists of baby names, and planning how to rearrange their small home to accommodate a nursery. But Robert never returned. On the 4th day, a solemn-faced ranch hand knocked on Sarah's door. "There's been an accident, Mrs. Thompson," he said, his hat clutched in his hands. Robert's horse spooked crossing a river. He didn't make it. Sarah's world collapsed. The news hit her like a physical blow, knocking the vive breath from her lungs. She refused to believe it at first, convinced there had been some terrible mistake. But when William Thompson arrived to confirm the tragic news, The reality of her loss finally sank in. "The funeral will be tomorrow," William informed her, his voice devoid of emotion. "The family chapel at noon." He left without offering comfort, without acknowledging the grandchild Sarah carried. Alone in the cottage she had shared with Robert, Sarah wept until she had no tears left. How could this happen? How could she raise their child without him? What would become of them now? The funeral was a blur. Sarah stood beside the Thompsons, a black veil hiding her swollen eyes. The Thompson estate loomed large against the morning sky as Sarah made her way up the winding path. Despite having been married to their son for nearly a year, she had rarely been invited inside. The imposing structure, with its stone facade and tall windows, seemed to watch her approach with the same cold detachment as its owners. Sarah smoothed down her black dress, still the only appropriate attire for a widow of 3 days, and took a deep breath before knocking on the heavy oak door. A maid she didn't recognize answered and silently led her to William Thompson's study. The room smelled of leather and cigar smoke. William sat behind a massive desk, papers spread before him, while Elizabeth perched stiffly on a chair nearby. Neither rose when Sarah entered. "Sit down," William instructed, gesturing to a chair opposite his desk. Sarah complied, her hands folded protectively over her stomach. "You wanted to speak with me about my situation?" William exchanged a glance with his wife before speaking. "Yes. As you know, Robert was being groomed to take over management of the ranch. His unfortunate passing has created certain complications." Sarah blinked, surprised by the businesslike tone. "I understand this is difficult for all of us. But let me be direct, Mrs. Thompson," William interrupted. "Robert had taken out loans against his future inheritance to make some investments that didn't pan out." "Loans? I don't understand." "Robert never mentioned any financial difficulties," Elizabeth scoffed softly. "Our son had his pride. He wouldn't have burdened you with such matters." William slid a document across the desk. Robert owed nearly $15,000 to various creditors. Debts that now fall to his estate, which means they fall to you. Sarah stared at the paper, the numbers swimming before her eyes. $15,000. It was an astronomical sum. "This can't be right. We lived so simply." "The cottage was just for show," Elizabeth said coldly. "Robert maintained appearances here while traveling. He had expensive tastes." The implication stung, but Sarah refused to let them tarnish her memories. "Even if these debts are real, I have no way to pay them. The cottage belongs to your family. I have no assets." "Precisely our dilemma," William replied. "However, we've found a solution that could benefit everyone involved." Something in his tone made Sarah's skin crawl. She waited, one hand still resting on her belly. "We have an associate, James Harrington. He owns a successful mining operation in Colorado. He's recently widowed and has expressed interest in taking on a new wife." William's eyes flicked briefly to Sarah's stomach. "He's willing to assume Robert's debts in exchange for the arrangement." For a moment, Sarah couldn't speak, certain she had misunderstood. "You want to sell me? To a stranger?" "Don't be dramatic," Elizabeth snapped. "We're offering you security. Mr. Harrington is wealthy and established. He can provide for you and the child far better than you could alone." "This is insane," Sarah whispered, rising from her chair. "I won't do it. I'll find work. I'll pay the debt somehow." William's expression hardened. "With what skills? Do you think you can support a child on a maid's wages? And that's assuming anyone would hire a pregnant widow." "I'll return to Michigan. My parents can barely support themselves," Elizabeth finished. "Robert told us all about your family's financial struggles. Would you burden them further?" Sarah felt trapped, cornered like an animal. "I need time to think." "Time is a luxury we don't have," William stated. "The creditors are already making inquiries. Mr. Harrington will be here tomorrow to finalize the arrangement. And if I refuse? William's smile didn't reach his eyes. Then we'll be forced to sell the cattle to cover Robert's debts. Without the herd, the ranch fails. 30 families who depend on this ranch for their livelihood will be ruined. Is that what you want? The manipulation was obvious but effective. Sarah sank back into her chair, mind racing for alternatives and finding none. Mr. Harrington is aware of your condition? She asked finally. Elizabeth nodded. He lost his own child along with his wife. He sees this as an opportunity to have the family he's always wanted. I don't even know this man. You didn't know Robert when you agreed to marry him, William pointed out. At least with Harrington, you'll be financially secure. Sarah looked between her in-laws, searching for any sign of compassion, any recognition that she was a grieving widow, not a commodity to be traded. She found none. May I at least meet him before deciding? William's expression suggested he'd already won. Of course. He'll arrive on the afternoon train. We'll have dinner together, and you can make your decision afterward. Sarah stood on shaky legs. If you'll excuse me, I need some air. Neither Thompson moved to stop her as she fled the study. Outside, the dining room of the Thompson estate felt cavernous and cold despite the crackling fire in the hearth. Sarah sat rigidly in her chair, picking at the roast beef on her plate, acutely aware of the man seated across from her. James Harrington was not what she had expected. In her mind, she had conjured an image of someone older, perhaps cruel-looking, with hard eyes and a stern mouth. The reality was quite different. He appeared to be in his mid-30s, with dark hair graying slightly at the temples, a well-trimmed beard, and deep-set eyes that seemed to observe everything with careful consideration. Mrs. Thompson, William's voice cut through her thoughts. Perhaps you'd like to tell Mr. Harrington about yourself. Sarah looked up, meeting James Harrington's gaze directly for the first time since introductions had been made. I'm not sure what you'd like to know, Mr. Harrington. I imagine the Thompsons have already told you the essentials. A flicker of something amusement perhaps crossed Harrington's face. They've shared the basic circumstances, yes. But I'd prefer to hear from you directly. His voice was deeper than she'd anticipated, with an accent that suggested an Eastern. Education. Sarah took a small sip of water, buying time to compose her thoughts. I grew up in Michigan. My father is a carpenter. I married Robert last year and moved here to Montana. Now I find myself widowed and expecting a child, being offered payment for debts I knew nothing about. The words came out more sharply than she'd intended, and she saw Elizabeth Thompson's lips thin with disapproval. Rather than being offended, Harrington nodded slowly, direct and honest. I appreciate that. William cleared his throat. Perhaps we should discuss the practical aspects of the arrangement. Yes, Harrington agreed, setting down his fork. Mrs. Thompson, I understand how unusual this situation must seem to you. I want to be clear about what I'm proposing. Sarah steeled herself, waiting for the worst. I own a mining operation near Denver. My home is comfortable, if not lavish. I can provide financial security for you and your child. In return, I ask that you maintain my household and present yourself as my wife in social situations. And what of marital obligations? Sarah forced herself to ask, her cheeks burning. A shadow passed over Harrington's face. I lost my wife and unborn child to fever last winter. I have no expectations in that regard, Mrs. Thompson. This would be a marriage of convenience, nothing more. Sarah studied him, trying to detect any deceit in his words. Why would you want this arrangement? Mr. Harrington? Surely a man in your position could find a willing bride without buying one. Elizabeth gasped at Sarah's bluntness, but Harrington merely smiled faintly. A fair question. The truth is, Mrs. Thompson, I've built a reputation in Denver as a family man. Business associates and their wives have already begun parading their unmarried daughters and sisters before me. I find the process distasteful. He paused, taking a sip of wine. This arrangement solves multiple problems. You need security. I need to avoid becoming the target of every matchmaking matron in Colorado. The child will have a name and a future. It was coldly pragmatic, yet somehow less offensive than the Thompsons' approach. At least Harrington was honest about his motivations. And if I refuse? Sarah asked, though she already knew the answer. William's voice hardened. Then, as we discussed, the debt remains. We'll be forced to sell assets to cover it, which will affect many families beyond our own. Harrington's eyes narrowed slightly at William's tone. Perhaps Mrs. Thompson and I could speak privately after dinner. I believe this conversation would benefit from fewer participants. The suggestion clearly displeased William, but he nodded. Curtly, the library should provide adequate privacy. The remainder of the meal passed in uncomfortable silence. When the plates were cleared, Harrington stood and offered Sarah his arm. Shall we? Sarah hesitated before placing her hand lightly on his sleeve, allowing him to escort her to the library. Once inside, he closed the door and immediately stepped away, giving her space. Please, sit wherever you're comfortable, he said, gesturing to the various chairs and sofas. Sarah chose a high-backed chair near the window, where moonlight spilled across the floor. Harrington took a seat opposite her, maintaining a respectful distance. Mrs. Thompson, please call me Sarah, she interrupted. If we're to discuss such personal matters, formality seems pointless. He nodded. Sarah, then. And I'm James. I want to speak candidly with you, away from the Thompsons' influence. I would appreciate candor. James leaned forward slightly. I understand how this must appear to you. The timing is cruel, coming so soon after your loss. If there were another way, I would suggest it. Is there truly no alternative? Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The debts are real, he confirmed. I've reviewed the documentation myself. Your late husband made some unfortunate investments. Sarah closed her eyes briefly, absorbing yet another revelation about the man she thought she'd known. And the Thompsons cannot cover these debts themselves? They could, James admitted, surprising her with his honesty. But they won't. William Thompson is not a man who forgives easily, even his own son. So I'm to be punished for Robert's mistakes. Or saved from them, James countered softly. Depending on how you view the situation. She wrote a brief letter to her parents, explaining what had happened in the gentlest terms possible, promising to write again once she was settled in Denver. Then, squaring her shoulders, she walked back to the Thompson estate to inform them of her decision. A new chapter was beginning, one she had never imagined for herself. Yet as she walked through the morning mist, Sarah felt a strange sense of determination replacing her despair. Perhaps, just perhaps, this arrangement would offer more than mere survival. The journey to Denver was long and jarring, the train's rhythmic clacking a constant reminder of the distance growing between Sarah and everything she had known. She sat beside James in a private compartment, the plush seats and wood paneling. Speaking of a luxury she had rarely experienced, for most of the journey, they maintained a polite but distant conversation, discussing practical matters, the layout of his home, the servants she would oversee, the social expectations of Denver. Society. James was unfailingly courteous, ensuring her comfort at every stop, but never presuming familiarity. We'll arrive tomorrow morning, he informed her as the sun began to set, painting the passing landscape in gold and amber. I've sent a telegram ahead to prepare the house. Sarah nodded, her eyes fixed on the changing terrain outside the window. The vast Montana plains had given way to the rugged foothills of Colorado, a physical manifestation of the transformation in her life. Are you comfortable? I can ask the porter for more pillows if you wish. I'm fine, thank you, Sarah replied, her hand instinctively moving to her stomach, a gesture that didn't escape James's notice. How far along are you? he asked, his voice softening slightly. Nearly 3 months now. James nodded thoughtfully. My wife was 4 months when... He trailed off, then cleared his throat. You should see Dr. Bennett when we arrive in Denver. He's discreet and well-respected. Thank you. I would appreciate that. Silence fell between them again, not entirely uncomfortable but laden with unspoken thoughts. As darkness descended and the lamps were lit in the compartment, Sarah found herself studying James's profile when he turned to look out the window. There was a sadness etched in the lines around his eyes, a grief she recognized all too well. May I ask about your wife? She ventured cautiously. James remained still for so long that Sarah thought he might ignore the question. Then he exhaled slowly. Her name was Eleanor. We were married for 7 years. You loved her very much. It wasn't a question, but he answered. Anyway, yes, ours was not an arranged marriage like ... He gestured vaguely between them. We met at a social gathering in Boston. She was visiting relatives. I was there on business. Sarah waited, sensing he might continue if not pressed. Eleanor was different from the women I knew in Denver. Well-educated, outspoken, with ideas about everything from politics to literature. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. She scandalized half of Denver society when she organized a women's reading group that discussed scientific journals instead of poetry. The image was so at odds with the practical businessman beside her that Sarah couldn't help but ask, "And you didn't mind having such an unconventional wife?" Mind? I encouraged it. Eleanor brought color to a life that had been primarily focused on building wealth and status. His expression darkened. When she fell ill, it happened so quickly. 3 days from the first fever to... He stopped abruptly. Forgive me. This isn't appropriate conversation. On the contrary, Sarah said softly. If we're to live together, even in this unusual arrangement, knowing something of each other's past seems necessary. James studied her face, as if reassessing her. You're right, of course. And what of you, Sarah? How did you come to marry Robert Thompson? The question stung, reopening wounds still raw from betrayal. I thought it was love, she admitted. Her voice barely audible over the train's rumble. Robert was charming, attentive. He spoke of grand plans for our future. She laughed bitterly. I never imagined those plans were being built on borrowed money. You shouldn't blame yourself, James sighed. From what I gathered, Robert was quite convincing when he wanted to be. Were you acquainted with him? James hesitated before answering. We had business dealings, nothing substantial. Enough to know his character. Something in his tone suggested there was more to the story, but Sarah was too exhausted to press further. The emotional toll of the past week had drained her completely. You should rest, James said, noticing her fatigue. There's a sleeping compartment prepared for you next door. I'll remain here. Sarah nodded gratefully and retired to the adjacent compartment. Despite her exhaustion, sleep came fitfully, her dreams filled with fragments of her old life, intermingling with anxious visions of the unknown future awaiting her. In Denver. Morning arrived with a jolt as the train began slowing for its approach. Into the city. Sarah dressed quickly in one of the modest black dresses she had packed, arranging her hair as best she could without assistance. When she rejoined James in the main compartment, he was already dressed in a well-tailored suit, his appearance impeccable. We'll be arriving shortly, he informed her, offering a cup of hot tea from a service that had been delivered while she dressed. I thought you might appreciate this before we disembark. Thank you. The small gesture of consideration touched her unexpectedly. As the train pulled into Denver's Union Station, Sarah got her first glimpse of the city that would now be her home. It was larger and more bustling than she had imagined, with imposing brick buildings and wide streets filled with carriages and pedestrians. My carriage should be waiting, James said as they gathered their belongings. The house is about 20 Minutes from here, in a neighborhood called Capitol Hill. The station was crowded, but James navigated them efficiently through the throng, maintaining a protective presence without being overbearing. Outside, a sleek black carriage waited, the driver jumping down immediately upon seeing them. "Welcome back, Mr. Harrington," the driver said, tipping his hat before turning his attention to Sarah. "Ma'am." "Thank you, Thomas," James replied. "This is Mrs. Harrington." The words sent an odd shiver through Sarah. Mrs. Harrington, a new identity imposed by circumstance rather than choice. The carriage ride provided Sarah with a tour of her new city grand public buildings, bustling commercial districts, and finally, the tree-lined streets of Capitol Hill, where stately homes spoke of wealth and permanence. James's house, her house now, she reminded herself, was an impressive 3-story structure of red brick with white trim, set back from the street behind a neat iron fence. As the carriage pulled up to the gate, Sarah noted the well-tended garden and the gleaming windows that suggested a well-run household. "It's lovely," she said honestly. "It's served me well enough," James replied modestly. Eleanor had plans to renovate the 3rd floor into a proper library, but ... He let the sentence hang unfinished as the carriage came to a stop. The front door opened before Sarah studied the older woman, sensing genuine affection for her employer. "Thank you for telling me, Mrs. Fletcher. I appreciate your candor." Left alone, Sarah moved slowly around the room, trailing her fingers over the spines of books, examining the small personal items that had belonged to Eleanor Harrington. It felt strange, stepping into another woman's life, occupying spaces shaped by her tastes and habits. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. When she opened it, she found James standing in the hallway, his hat in his hands. "I hope the accommodations are suitable," he said. "I must go to the office briefly. There are matters requiring my immediate attention. But I wanted to make sure you were settled first." "Everything is perfect, thank you." He nodded, seemingly relieved. "Mrs. Fletcher will see to anything you need. I've also arranged for a dressmaker to visit tomorrow. Your current wardrobe is..." He hesitated, clearly trying to be tactful. "Inadequate for my new position," Sarah finished for him. "I understand. I'll return for dinner. We can discuss any questions you might have then." He turned to leave, then paused. "Sarah, I know this isn't what you wanted, but I hope in time you might find some contentment here." The sincerity in his voice caught her off guard. "Thank you, James. I hope so too." After he left, Sarah moved to the window, watching as his carriage pulled away from the house. She placed her hand on her stomach, feeling a surge of protectiveness for the life growing within her. "Well, little one," she whispered, "this is our new beginning. Not what I imagined for us, but perhaps." She looked around the elegant room, thinking of James's respectful distance, Mrs. Fletcher's kind eyes, the security this arrangement provided. Perhaps we can make something of it after all. Outside, Denver stretched before her, unknown and intimidating, but also full of possibilities. Sarah had lost everything she thought she wanted, had been treated as a commodity to be traded, had discovered painful truths about the man she had loved. Yet standing in this room, in this new life imposed by circumstances beyond her control, she felt an unexpected stirring of hope that it wasn't love. It wasn't the fairy tale she had once believed in, but it was a chance for safety, for stability, for her child's future. And for now, that would have to be enough.